you've got all these politicians that are essentially in this Skinner box where they're responding to the incentives of social media. Clearly, there's something wrong with the idea that privately held platforms can become so publicly important, and yet there are no fail safes.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephen Parton, and you're listening to the Feedback Loop on Singularity Radio. This week, our guest is research scientist and adjunct professor Justin Hendrix, who is the CEO and editor of Tech Policy Press, a nonprofit media community dedicated to exploring the intersection of technology and democracy. In this episode, Justin and I enjoy a wide tour through a variety of topics, including political polarization, social media as a public square, social media as a public utility, the economic possibilities of universal basic income, and a whole lot more. Justin brings a rich collection of knowledge that he put forth in this conversation with a calm clarity that I truly appreciated, and I hope you'll feel the same. So, everyone, please welcome to the Feedback Loop, Justin Hendrix. Cool, man. Well, I think the best place, most obvious place, probably to start with you then, is with Tech Policy Press. Obviously, something that you spend a lot of your energy on. So maybe to start, you could just tell us what the inspiration and motivation were behind starting this nonprofit.
Sure. Tech Policy Press started as a kind of side hustle. My co-founder Brian Jones and I were running a blog under the name Protego Press. This is now a few years ago, looking at similar issues. This Tech Policy Press's current editorial remit, and in the midst of the pandemic in 2020, I decided I would like to take a go at trying to make this side hustle my, you know, particular focus. And so we essentially set up Tech Policy Press as a 501c3 and set out to kind of create a prototype of a media and community site that would gather ideas from across a wide range of disciplines at the intersection of concerns around tech and democracy, tech and society. So I've been up to that now for 2 years.
Nice. And when I think of that intersection that you're talking about there between technology and democracy, I can't help but kind of think of people like the early tech optimists of the 90s, like Douglas Rushkoff, and their kind of hopes that this new technology would unlock empathy and free expression, and we'd see an empowerment of our government and all of these things. And then I think a lot of people would say around 2012, 2016, this maybe went the completely opposite direction. Where do you stand now in terms of how you feel this technology slash democracy relationship has unfolded?
It's interesting you bring up Doug Rushkoff. I've actually been teaching with Doug Rushkoff for the last few years in a course called Tech, Media, and Democracy that brings together faculty from across multiple campuses in New York at NYU, Cornell Tech, the New School, um, Columbia, as well as Queens College, where Doug is a professor. And of course, he's taught me a lot. I've learned a lot from working with him and from reading his work. And that class, which was really at the root of the inspiration for me in getting involved in these issues and launching Tech Policy Press, um, was meant to kind of look at this relationship almost from the perspective of, is this a crisis? Is this a crisis moment? Are we seeing, you know, um, externalities and problems that are emerging that may, truly pose a kind of existential threat to democracy? And I mean, I think it's fair to say that part of the reason for that were the types of concerns that came along at the outset of the Trump administration. Many of the concerns around social media and disinformation, which of course became very prominent in those moments thereafter. Things like the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and then of course the ramp up of regulation in Europe, in particular, and lots of discussion about potential regulation, perhaps here in the United States and elsewhere. So as far as where we're at on that continuum between perhaps optimism and pessimism, I think we're still in a slightly difficult place where some of the maybe more market driven aspects of that optimism are still very much at play. And we, in at least in this country, do not yet have any sufficient kind of plan for what we would like a tech policy to look like in this country. We don't have things like comprehensive privacy regulation. We don't have anything, of course, as uh, comprehensive around social media as the Digital Services Act in the EU. We don't have, a kind of comprehensive AI policy, although there has been some movement in that direction. So there's still a long way to go. And on some level, we're still operating with the same rules as we had in that 90s period or 90s or early aughts period, even though we've learned, quite a lot since then.
Well, and speaking of maybe running by outdated rules, you know, is the American government or any modern government that's kind of founded on a several hundred or thousand-year old constitution, is it ready to adapt to the changes that technology is bringing down the line? Like, is there something maybe unique about the American government that has caused it to maybe lag behind these other countries? Or is every country just kind of in the same boat because they're not really made for this kind of paradigm?
We could probably spend our entire hour on this question, and I'd probably veer into some areas that I don't know enough about. But I do think that what we're seeing right now in the United States, at least, is a kind of urgency from both parties around different issues. They both have big tech in their crosshairs, but for different reasons. I think a lot of people were very disappointed that what appeared to be a kind of bipartisan consensus on antitrust and issues around competition um, didn't produce much more than a merger filing fee modernization out of the last Congress, and there's little hope that a lot is planning to come out of this Congress, even on topics where it appears there's some consensus across both parties. Maybe around things like child safety, or even privacy for that matter, where the American Data Privacy and Protection Act, of course, passed with bipartisan support out of committee. Um, I think there's something going on that some folks have suggested, really has to do with just the kind of breakdown between the two parties, the ability to find consensus, and the fact that, at least on some level, it's good business for politicians to say they want to do something about tech, and to continue to fundraise on it and continue to kind of, call out the injustices, whatever those injustices might be from their perspective, and perhaps less good business to necessarily solve anything.
Yeah, well, you touch on something there that I think is really important, which is the polarization. And I feel like a central feature of pretty much any social institution, especially as it relates to government or politics, is a degree of trust in some common narrative or common purpose. And we often talk about how much the parties are divided into their own little subjective reality tunnels. But we're fragmented into our own little worlds on social media as the masses who are voting. But I can't help but think so are the politicians, right? They're also in their own fragmented tribe of subjectivity. How do you think, I guess, social media is impacting our ability to really push forward in the
Mhm.
government, but whether from the masses changing the zeitgeist because they're too busy fighting each other, or the politicians not actually pushing policy forward because they're too busy fighting each other.
I helped to write a report last year on social media and political polarization with Paul Barrett at the NYU Center for Business and Human Rights. And we talked about some of these issues in that report, in particular, looking at polarization's effect on the legislative process in the US. And I think there's a lot of questions here about the fact that you've got all of these politicians that are essentially in this Skinner box now. They're in this like game where they're responding to the incentives of social media. And other players in the game are also responding to the incentives of social media. So, whether it's media and journalists, people in civil
Mhm.
society, voters themselves, everybody is kind of vying for attention in this mechanism. And, research that we have on this, computational social science research, as well as internal documents we've seen from places like Facebook. It appears that those incentives are very powerful, and they're affecting the behavior not only of politicians, but also clearly of media entities and the like, and driving them, of course, to more extreme polls, essentially. And so, one of the things I think was most concerning about the Facebook leaks from Francis Hogan was essentially that politicians were embracing and pursuing more extreme agendas, essentially to be certain that they would get better reach across social media or across Facebook in particular. And so, just think about that dynamic kind of reflexively operating for years and years and years. And that's where we're at, right? I'm not saying, and nor did the report say, that social media is the sole cause of
Mhm.
polarization in this country or any other, or the sole cause of the reason that legislators aren't getting along terribly well. There are other reasons, but it does appear to be making things worse.
Yeah, I can't say I've never thought about this before, but it's kind of striking me as profound as you say this now that these politicians are equally as maybe addicted to these tools as the average person are, and maybe therefore don't have the incentive to actually change it. It's hard to cut an addict off of their drug, and if you're a politician, why would you cut your supply?
I can't remember the exact hearing, but there's this one particular moment where a camera caught Texas Senator Ted Cruz, asking a fiery set of questions, and then immediately going on Twitter to see what the response
Mm.
is in real time, right? So that to me like kind of really was a sort of like poignant little moment that shows exactly where we're at. That people are not only very aware of how they're performing in front of the social
Mhm.
media, you know, audience, as it were, but they're quite literally looking for that feedback and looking for those signals instantly.
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think of the idea of the public square, the historic public square where we might come together, where we might have those fiery revolutions take place and we socialize and we decide to change the zeitgeist of a generation. And that's now all mediated by a screen and by algorithms that are shaping what people see. How do you think that that's impacting the conversation? We're not really out doing that in person dynamic anymore. Is that changing the way our democracy is really functioning at this point?
One of the books I always think about when I encounter a question like this one
Hmm.
is from Jose Marichal, who's a professor out at uh, California Lutheran, who wrote about Facebook and democracy all the way back in 2012. So he was kind of, perhaps early to this conversation. And, he makes the point that you've literally got these mechanisms that are somewhat replacing or standing in for democratic functions, or certainly democratic investment, time and effort that individuals used to put into the other mechanisms. So it's common now, for instance, for maybe neighbors to fight over some civic issue in a Facebook group, but never to attend a community board meeting, right? So there's a big question. I think that, by the way, that is a reality at various levels, not just at the local level. But there are a lot of questions there about,
Mhm.
where is the legitimate democratic discourse? Is it on Twitter? Is it somehow on TikTok? Is it
Mhm.
all of those places? Is it at the community board meeting? Um, and that's part of what's going on here. Is there's almost a kind of challenge
Mhm.
to government. There's this other place now where it seems like um, these things are going to be debated, and the sort of weight of the masses, kind of conclusion on some matter should matter.
Hmm.
And the system's not really set up that way, right?
Right. Well, not to compel you to opine too much after our previous discussion about giving too many opinions prior to the chat, but do you think we're engaging in some golden age thinking here, thinking that it should remain an in-person experience, that we should be attending these community meetings, and that we need to maybe get on board with the technological version? Or maybe is there something truly lost, that in order for the human animal to function well, we need to stay in that in-person dynamic?
You know, I think this is a really good question, and pretty much the golden question. To some extent, do our democratic systems very much need to evolve and be updated for the digital age? I think most people would say yes. There does appear to be something wrong with the way that government operates in this age, that's sort of out of step with the way that most people are engaging with one another, and with political information, for that matter. And yet, what is the thing that should happen? I think there's not a good discourse around that. That's one of the things I hope to talk about on Tech Policy Press uh, in the years ahead. I think it is a multi-year, maybe even multi-decade conversation we've got to have. I remember some comments from Gideon Litchfield, who's now the editor in chief of Wired, along these lines, where he said something to the fact, and I don't want to put words in his mouth. So for some reason, Gideon, if you listen to this, I apologize. But um, you know, essentially that we may need to think about the technology of democracy, which, if you think about it, that's what democracy is. It's a kind of technology for coming to consensus. It was a technology that we developed perhaps in the age of horses, and carrier pigeons or what have you, and very early ways that information would spread, and we would of course need agents that we would essentially empower to go and represent us in certain contexts. And all of that does to some extent seem, perhaps, a bit old fashioned at this point. And yet, for the most part, that's what we've got, right? That is the legal structure that is in place in most of the world's democracies. And we've got a rule of law that demands that things function that way. So, how do we square these things? Some people think we can't, right? That we need to figure out ways to suborn these major platforms more effectively to democracy. And there are others who would much more rather us move to some model that looks more like the digital realm, perhaps empowers people in a more direct way on digital platforms.
Yeah, well, speaking of platforms, and you mentioned Musk and well, Twitter, I guess more specifically earlier, and it's got me thinking. While Twitter and Musk is an interesting topic, I think a more interesting discussion that you're alluding to here is the idea that maybe these platforms could or should in some way be brought in as public utilities, or have some increased regulation brought into them. Is that something that you agree with? Do you think that that's something that we should do? Is it still just a big question mark?
I think it's a big question mark. The clearly there's something wrong with the idea that privately held platforms can become so publicly important, and yet there are no fail safes, right? You think about Twitter, and you think about all of the uses that governments have for it to inform citizens. Everything from earthquake alerts to whether alternate side parking is on or off here in New York City. These are things that I might get via Twitter, and yet I'm totally at the whim now of Elon Musk, and whether the thing's going to operate from one day to the next. And you might look at that and say, well, government should never have relied on these private platforms. And yet there's something I think most people would agree, like practical, about the idea that whether it's Twitter or other platforms, People are, for the most part, that's where they're at. And so if you want to reach them with information, to some extent, you have to use these platforms at this point. And I don't think we've got that solved.
Yeah. You mentioned something else a minute ago that kind of sparked an idea for me. You mentioned the carrier pigeons and the horse and the limitations that that provided. And it makes me think that as technology has advanced, we've certainly become a more connected globe. You know, the geopolitical landscape has changed pretty drastically. But what is interesting to me in some ways is that as we've gotten more connected, it feels like an immune response has taken place for a lot of these countries where maybe too much cultural influence came in too quickly through the pipes. And rather than increase cooperation, it seems that a lot of countries are retracting. Is this something that you are seeing as well, or am I just kind of making this up as a thing that's happening?
One of the groups that I try to keep close tabs on is the folks at Freedom House, who put out the Internet Freedom Report every year. And they look across the globe and they look at this question across the globe, really. How are states permitting or restricting free expression? What are the types of surveillance mechanisms that states are employing against their citizens? How is technology affecting the ability of individuals to express themselves, organize, et cetera? And unfortunately, when you look at that question from a sort of methodologically sound place, which Freedom House does, every year things are getting worse, right? Every year, fewer people are in a place where a free expression is, well preserved. Every year, people are living in more circumstance where individuals may be arrested or imprisoned for things that they say or do online. Every year, the surveillance apparatus grows in large parts of the world. And this is one of my, again, key concerns. When we talk about tech and democracy, we can't escape the reality that democracy is backsliding across the globe every year, year on year. This has been true now for a decade or almost 2 decades, depending on which measure you look at. So, back to that question about optimism versus constraint or pessimism, whatever you want to call it. Um, Things are not moving in the right direction on this. And that's one of the things I think we have to get hold of. We have to figure out how to create a pro-democratic tech movement. Um, Technologies, platforms, ideas, tech policy, regulations that are pro-democratic.
This is obviously a bold question that if you could answer correctly, you would get the Nobel Prize for. But is there anything that you think could stop that backslide? Is there maybe like a straw for the camel's back, so to speak, that could, if we could just maybe get this one thing tweaked in the right way, we might start going in a better direction?
I do think that the United States has to figure out how to incentivize its technology firms in a way that produces better democratic outcomes.
Hmm.
If we're to be hopeful that similar gains can be made elsewhere in the world. Now, the EU has, to some extent, leapfrogged us in terms of innovative tech regulation. A lot of folks listening to this probably say, well, actually, no, they're far too paternal and, they're killing innovation, et cetera. I don't tend to think that. I read their documents. I look at the amount of diligence and that goes into the thinking around their legislation, the amount of kind of expert consideration and consultation, the care they put into things like the Digital Services Act. And will there be unintended consequences? Absolutely. But in a functioning legislative system, if there are unintended consequences that you regard as negative or counter to what you set out to do with a particular law or regulation, you can reverse it or you can alter it or you can update it. But where we're at in the United States, unfortunately, is everybody kind of has this idea that if we pass anything, we'll have to live with it for 40 years. So we might as well not, because we have no idea what will go wrong.
Yeah. Do you think those who would claim that is too paternalistic and that government needs to stay out of everything basically are kind of being naive in terms of the scope and scale of what is happening here? Because I think, I always love bringing things back to an evolutionary environment, and I think we were probably meant to be in groups of about 150 people as humans, and now we have countries of hundreds of millions or billions. Like it feels like to say that government shouldn't be involved in that in some way, that you're not going to have issues that government needs to step in and handle is, I don't know. Again, I think maybe kind of naive.
A paper that I will share with you after we talk that I think about a lot is one by a friend of mine, a guy called Joe Bach Coleman, who's now at Columbia, formerly at the University of Washington, along with, I think, about 24 other authors from a variety of disciplines. And the paper is called The Stewardship of Global Collective Behavior. And it's this sort of essentially kind of argument that essentially what you say is true, right? That there's something kind of fundamental going on here, that we're fiddling with the species in a way that we never have with digital media and communications technologies, with social media. And there's a gap in our knowledge, right, about how these technologies will affect our ability to progress as a species, whether that is our ability to, produce new information, disseminate that information, or how our democracies function, how we respond to crises like pandemics and the environmental crisis that we're going to increasingly find is perhaps the most important crisis that the species will face. And there's this sort of question about, like, how do we get to a point where we can steward our collective behavior, steward our social systems in the direction that results in, you know, good outcomes for the species? And that seems to me to be the open question at this point.
Yeah.
And does government have a role to play in that? Absolutely. What form of government? What is that role? What should it be? That's the open question. And listen, people on both sides of the argument have really legitimate arguments. Some people are rightly concerned about too much government and authoritarian outcomes, etc. Others are concerned about too little government, right? And capitalism run amok, and big tech platforms that are unconstrained by state power. And both have legitimate grievances, and unfortunately we're going to have to find some balance.
I'm wondering if that political polarization leading to a stalemate that we talked about at the national level is going to impact that stewardship at the global level. Because I can't help but wonder, are we going to get into an East versus West type dynamic here, with China and its approach to technology, which is kind of like run full steam ahead, do some experimentation and social things that maybe the Western world doesn't agree with, and the West has its own individualistic approach. Do you feel like we're going to maybe get in a similar bottleneck there where that stewardship is really hard to bring forward?
So, when we talk about China, this is one of those areas where I want to be very careful to not overstate what I do and do not know. I've been to China
Hmm.
once in my life. I have visited two cities in China. I have, of course, read and studied aspects of Chinese politics and culture, but I do not in any way consider myself an expert. But let me just go out on a limb and say, I think one of the interesting things that's going on, at least when you do zoom back perhaps to the moon and look down, is China, on some level, is far more restrictive in terms of what it is allowing its tech firms to do um, in a domestic context. And it's very interesting. They've got, certainly more rigid privacy concern, rules about the amount of time that people can spend with certain applications, rules against things like generative AI, deepfakes, that kind of thing. And of course, a much heavier hand when it comes to censorship and monitoring of public discourse on social media. Um, Whereas in the U.S., we have much more laissez-faire attitude on all these things, and yet we're permitting companies to do things that you know are truly worrisome, collecting massive amounts of information, developing technologies and tools that may well destabilize the information ecosystem, and if they run amok. And there's a real question here about which direction's the right one. And um, I personally believe that free expression and liberty and the sorts of things that we value in democracies is the better way to go, and will result in ultimately a species that thrives more so than the Chinese model. Um, and yet, I do think we're going to see attempts to kind of challenge that idea, or challenge my certainty on that over the next decades, as we face increasingly massive problems that authoritarianism may well produce more. I guess I don't know if the word is urgent or more immediate answers to. Now, those answers may not be the right ones. Look at COVID. The Chinese attempt to control COVID for a couple of years looked extraordinary, looked like a world beating, success. But then eventually the kind of, I guess, hubris of that approach ended up kind of falling apart, right? And so, it may be that in some cases that apparent kind of success is not real, and that ultimately be revealed to be a weaker model. But there may be other things where it is more successful. I keep thinking about environmental crises where maybe a government has to say to a whole group of people or an entire city, it's time to move away from the coast, or we need to completely change the form of energy that you're using. Whereas in the United States, it may take us years, decades to come to those conclusions, and we may carry on, in certain directions without the ability to take action because our democracy is slow and fiddles its way towards things. Um, you know, we may look at those situations and say, oh, maybe there's some benefit in this authoritarian approach. But I don't know. I kind of hold out hope that no matter what, at the end of the day, um, for the most part, democracy will prove to be even a better system
Mhm.
for managing information and crises.
Do you see a situation where that impetus, that pressure that comes from maybe issues like the environmental crisis that we're facing or any other issue is going to cause us to actually upgrade? Like, will we change the system in some way? Our governments, at least in like America, do you foresee that being a case where it will become something faster and more streamlined than kind of the 40-year turnaround that you're alluding to?
I think that depends on the people to some extent. In the United States, clearly things aren't going terribly well from a political point of view. We've got a lot of problems and a lot of discord, and our legislative process doesn't seem to be, uh, terribly productive. And a lot of people at different levels and from different political perspectives are concerned that there are some fundamental aspects of the system that are broken. And I do think that, you know, they could be right, and for different reasons, right? At some point, people may demand some more substantial change, right? Could you imagine a constitutional Congress where we might address some of these things? Could you imagine major reforms to the way that the Senate operates, or an expansion of the court, or an expansion of Congress itself, or some rebalancing of power between the branches of government, or some new constitutional order altogether? It's possible that within the next few decades we'll see that here. My hope is that somehow we can arrive at that without bloodshed.
Yeah.
But the reality is that most of the time, that's not how it goes.
Yeah, how do you think economics plays into this? We haven't really touched on that too much. Maybe I'll kind of leave it open and broad as a starting point. Like, what is the role of the economy in this relationship?
Again, this is such a big question, right? I I think that economic inequality, the kind of hyper capitalism that we're observing at the moment in much of the West and certainly the United States, the degree to which the economy appears to be really kind of fracturing into um, even in places like the United States into just increasingly looking like a kind of caste system. Um, I had this thing the other day, just to kind of illustrate this. There's a spot in Brooklyn that I pass sometimes where a lot of the delivery drivers have found that they can park. And for them, it's a good spot. It's right between a bunch of things that they service, like restaurants that they pick up deliveries from, grocery stores, etc. So these are your DoorDash delivery workers and food delivery workers, etc. Often, with these cheap e-bikes, and it's hard to look at this kind of scenario. These individuals who in New York we know have had to organize just to get the right to use the bathroom in the businesses that they serve. It's hard to look at their experience and look at their own woes that they express as they try to organize for more recognition and the rest, and not to look at it as a kind of caste type scenario. There's been a lot of great research and writing about individuals who are now kind of suborned to algorithms or managed by algorithms, managed on these platforms, and then these various precarious work situations and very precarious income and employment situations. And I don't know, all of that seems badly out of whack to me, and at some point will need to be addressed. And the workers can only work within the system, of course, if the system decides to work with them. And in fact, if they don't, then we can worry about more populist resentment and anger, and we'll see what that results in.
Yeah. Well, there were attempts to maybe upend that caste system in some ways with things like cryptocurrency and whatnot. But I feel like it also became its own kind of caste system, and now we're entering a phase that it seems like crypto is struggling pretty dramatically, I would say. But maybe there's still room for digital solutions to this. Do you see kind of a cryptocurrency solution, or maybe something like basic income, maybe something that's a digital basic income that is going to be needed or that could help us navigate these waters?
Um, I'm not an expert on crypto or blockchain
Mhm.
either, but I would regard myself as an armchair skeptic that cryptocurrency is the answer to any of these fundamental problems, either political or economic. I realize there are a lot of folks who are invested in that idea and who, in their ventures believe that that's what they're doing, that they're solving for large political questions. And some of them are, leftist utopians, and some of them are libertarian idealists. And some of the folks are right in the middle and just want to do practical stuff. But I think the jury's still very much out on whether cryptocurrency is part of the problem or part of the solution. So we'll just have to see. And I think in the meantime, we've been given over the last couple of years ample evidence that we should remain exceedingly skeptical. And that it is perfectly appropriate for people like me to maintain an adversarial point of view on whether this is the particular path or particular set of technologies that may ultimately lead us to utopia.
Yeah.
Um, when it comes to things like UBI, I mean, again, like you could have, I'm sure, much more expert economists come on and talk about these things. I sometimes worry, and this is maybe not the most informed point of view, but I sometimes worry that UBI is a kind of sort of get out of jail free card for people who are concerned that AI is going to disrupt too many people's jobs, and oh, so we'll make sure we look after them well enough that they don't starve, but we're not going to do anything else, right, to
Yeah.
fix the economy or society to their advantage. We're just going to give them a bit of cash and hope things work out and mostly carry on as we have. We're not going to constrain companies, or we're not going to put in place new regulation, or we're not going to increase the power of labor, or we're not going to pay people more for their services. Rather, we're just going to kind of throw them a bone and let AI get on with itself.
Yeah. I'm going to take a bit of a jump here because I want to get your thoughts on this before we wrap up. But what about data and privacy? You alluded to it a bit earlier, I think, when we were talking about China, but what do you think about the current paradigm? The Facebook data that's being collected, TikTok data that's being collected, how we're um, basically letting all of the information about us be sold pretty much without thinking too much about it. Like, what do you think about this paradigm?
I was at an event last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago now, that was talking about the intersection of law and extended reality. So looking at XR, AR, VR, those types of technologies, and thinking about the implications in the law. And there was a good amount of conversation about privacy, and the fact that forget social media. When it comes to XR and virtual environments and the types of devices that we imagine people are going to have on their heads and other parts of their bodies to enable them to experience those types of immersive environments, the amount of data that's going to come off us is just extraordinary. It's sort of radiating biometric information and you know um, other signals from our nervous system and emotional recognition, that kind of thing. um, and just a lot of questions about how that data will be used, where it will be stored, how it will be minimized or destroyed, or stay on the device or leave the device, or et cetera. And I remember at the meeting there was this woman, Susan Aronson, who you might have had on your podcast in the past, who said, the future of tech is not about any particular technology. It's about how are we going to pool and utilize data in a way that creates value for the species, and doesn't and I'm by the way, I'm probably putting slightly words in her mouth, but doesn't give too much power to big tech corporations, doesn't end up hurting people's interests, doesn't end up hurting democracy, etc. And we've got to think about that, right? Because there's incredible power that will come off of exactly the type of data collection that I just mentioned, all kinds of diagnostics and assistive technologies and techniques and learning and education applications and various other forms of value that will be created by the collection and expression of that data. And yet, on the other hand, um, do we want all of that information, you know, in Elon Musk's hands, where
Right.
he may choose to hand it out however he might see fit? Do we want Mark Zuckerberg sitting on top of that trove with no rules in place? Really, that seems crazy to me. We've got to get this under control, or I suspect that as the technology advances, as AI advances, as various other communications technologies advance, we're going to introduce a true threat, not just to democracy, but to humanity.
Yeah. Well, it's natural, I think, as humans to engage our negativity bias and look at the things worth being concerned about. But I'd be remiss if I didn't, offer up an opportunity to maybe have you discuss some of the wins, some of the things that you think we've done well, some of the ways we've met that balance that I think you quoted there from Susan Aronson, I think you said her name was.
Mm.
Are there ways we have been able to benefit humanity without giving too much power to these corporations and institutions? that you can point to and say this was a thing we did well, this was a correct implementation of technology and democracy?
It is undeniable that social media has given voice to people who did not have voice in the media and information ecosystem of just 20 years ago or 10 years ago. That there are movements, there are concerns, there are expressions of problems and hopes and dreams and various other forms of expression that we would not know about or would not, I suppose, have such ready access to or hears in such volume were it not for social media. And I do think like 10, 20, 30 years from now, hopefully we'll have figured out how to have taken advantage of that extraordinary thing, this ability to empower individual voices to rise up and to be heard in a way that improves our ability to arrive at a more just, a more plural, a more successful, and economically and environmentally sustainable way. We're just not there yet, and I do think it eventually we'll look back and regard um, digital communications technology, social media, as a kind of miracle. But we're going to have to figure out exactly that thing that you stated earlier, which is, how does it challenge some of these innate evolutionary mechanisms that we're fiddling with and we don't really understand?
Yeah, absolutely. Justin, I got one last question for you, maybe the hardest of all for a lot of people. Is there anything at all that you would like to leave people with? Any closing remarks, any closing thoughts, anything you would just like to put out to the people to tell them about what you're working on? Anything at all?
Well, I certainly would encourage folks to check out techpolicy.press and sign up for the newsletter. We have a podcast and we'll be running some events in 2023. Appreciate the opportunity to talk about it here. And I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm about to start this semester again, teaching again this course on tech, media, and democracy. And it, I'm always looking for like, what have we learned in the last year? What is a sort of new consensus, or what is the sort of new baseline from which to talk about these things? And I do think we've made an enormous amount of progress in just the last half decade or decade or so at understanding the relationship between tech and social cohesion, the relationship between tech and democracy. And I just encourage anybody that might be listening to this that works in tech to think about, how can I be part of a pro-democratic movement in my work? That's not going to be easy for everybody. If you're um, QAing code or something like that, and you've got just a time constraint on you, and you've got to get that work done every day. Maybe you can't look up to think about this broader question. But over the course of your career, I suspect there are opportunities for you in the conversations you have, in the places where you volunteer or donate your time or expertise, in the mentoring you do for people who are coming from behind, um, to think about these questions. And they're not just ethical questions, but they're also ethical questions. How can I be part of creating a technology ecosystem and a kind of fabric of technology in our lives that supports that democratic, that pluralist, that more equitable and just society that we'd like to see?
Yeah, I love that. Well said, Justin. Again, man, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I really do appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, sir.